Well, the Nebraska spring game is finally upon us. After all of the news out of spring that we've been hearing the last few weeks, we finally get to see some of it come to fruition on the field, and it is long overdue. It's been a short slash long off season at the same time. It'd be like that sometimes when you're coming off of a season like last year and have all of the, I guess, off season hype coming into next season, which is pretty typical with Nebraska. But we're going to kind of go over some things here. As you can see right over there on my right or on your right is Wilson Dittman from Wilson D Sports. I'm sure you've probably seen him on YouTube before. Independent creator, very, very good channel over there. Go check out what he's got. But we're going to do a two-part series here. Wilson, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell the people where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Wilson Dittman Sports on YouTube, again, posting about Nebraska football and Nebraska recruiting all the time. And yeah, like Justin was saying, we're going to be going over our top 5 players to watch out for in the spring game. That's part one. And then part two, we're going to go over some storylines. That's going to be on my channel in a couple of days. So watch out for that part two.
Exactly. Yep. So, without further ado, let's just go ahead and we'll start in the 5 players to watch here. And before we get into those, just kind of what was your mindset in coming up with the players that you picked? And I've noticed some things where we didn't really pick a lot of the guys that are already standouts, like the Vincent Shavers and the guys like that, or some of the obvious guys. I might have a couple in mind, but what was your thought process in coming up with your players?
Yeah, and I was going over my 5 players. I took a little bit of a different approach. I looked for guys who might be hyped up, but we've never really seen them in a Nebraska uniform before. Basically, all of my guys are depth pieces, guys on the third, second string, but they're all super young guys who are going to be starters maybe this year, maybe next year. And that if you're a Nebraska fan, you got to watch out for going forward.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, mine it was a lot of gut feeling guys I really like, but also just trying to find a fine line between just seeing certain players that may be big names. I'll have a player who probably is on a lot of people's lists, but it's just some of the nuances in there from what we're hearing from the coaches that we would like to see from them in the spring game. So just an idea of our thought processes behind these. But first things first, let's just go ahead and get into your first player to watch, and then we'll dive into it a little bit.
Yep, number 1 for me is wide receiver Demetrius Bell going into his second year, redshirt freshman, and he's probably the most hyped up, if not the second most hyped up wide receiver on the team. I mean, you look at him in his high school days, 4-star recruit, had a 1K all-purpose yards the senior year of high school. But really, he's went viral over the last couple months with his workout videos on social media. Matt Rule's been raving about him. Some of the coaching staff, they've been raving about him. And really, he's a plug and play guy this year, one of those depth pieces that you'd prefer to put at the wide receiver Z spot. Maybe not big enough for the wide receiver X spot, not small enough for slot, but you feel good about him. He has great speed, good size. Route running is very good, great hands. And it's all about the development in that wide receiver room, particularly with our young wide receiver coach, Garrett McGuire. If Demetrius Bell is as good as projected, you feel really good about 5, 6, 7 guys starting going forward in that wideout room. So that's my number 1. But I see you're going to take it to the other side of the football in the secondary.
Yeah, just to touch on Demetrius Bell just a second, kind of like you said, I think the biggest thing in this wide receiver room is going to try to be who establishes himself in this new pecking order, because it's a very unique kind of wide receiver room this year, where you have 2 wide receivers who were brought in from other places that are expected to possibly be your top 2 wide receivers, on top of a young core that actually showed a lot of flash and a lot of potential. And a lot of these young guys are showing their growth year over year because they were thrown into the fire a little bit last year. I'm going to go over to the defensive side, Bly Hill, and I've heard you talk about this before. The cornerback rotation in general is going to be a little bit of the cornerback 2 in general is going to be a little bit of a battle there, and has been throughout spring. But when we got Bly Hill, one of the transfers that came in this offseason, he was one of those guys that really kind of flew under the radar, was our lowest rated in terms of transfer guys, 89 rated 3-star. However, when you look at the tape and you look at some of the intangibles and some of the physical attributes that he fits the exact thing that you want in a prototypical cornerback. He has the length, he has the athleticism, he knows how to use his body. And he really has a good feel for just instinctual defensive play. And I'm very excited for Bly Hill. I think he's going to be able to come out and probably lock down that spot and be able to kind of free up some of these other guys to rotate into the safety position and things like that. And we'll start to see some of these guys move to where they, the coaching staff wants them due to the fact that we do have some depth now. So Bly Hill, I think, is going to surprise a lot of people, coming up. And I think he has a lot to show in the spring game that can kind of put him on people's map there.
Yeah, that's a really good pick there. And again, people forget how gifted he is. Everybody's talking about Dante Dowdle transferring in, Micah Mazuka transferring in, of course, Jamal Banks. But Bly Hill might be one of those instant impact guys that you plug in at cornerback 2, cornerback 3. And he's 6'3". Matt Rule loves taller corners. Tony White loves taller corners. I'll throw some stats at you real quick. In one of his games at the FCS level, he had 4 PBUs. That's the third most in FCS history, made records there. Only played in 9 games and one of their better players on defense. Yeah, you feel good about him, but hopefully the only concern I have is him taking that transition to FCS football up to Power 5 football in a matter of months.
Yep. That's the biggest thing you got to worry about is that jump. But we have seen it, in recent years, with a couple of guys that have taken that jump and really stood out. So it's one of those things where Nebraska's had pretty decent success with FCS players making that leap here in the last few years. So, all right, go ahead and take it away with your next one.
Yeah, my second player is going to be Gunnar Gatula, plays on the O-line, tackle, a little bit of guard. And this is a guy that came in from Lincoln Southeast. He was around the program at a young age, and he almost played as a true freshman, was ranked as a 3-star, almost 4-star recruit. And when you watch him on film for Lincoln Southeast, really quick feet, good size, good technique. I feel really good about his ceiling. He's 6'5", 300 pounds. But really, the development of him is going to be a testament to how good of a coach Donovan Raiola really is. We feel good about the starting 5 for the first time in a long time about that O-line. But it starts to see what we got in that 2 deep, right, with these young players, with Gunnar Gatula, with Sam Sledge, maybe with some of the true freshmen coming in like Grant Bricks and Gibson Pyle. And really, if Gunnar Gatula is as good as expected, let's say he's one of the better guys on that second or on that 2 deep this year, imagine how good some of the 4-stars that Donovan Raiola is about to land, how good they're going to be. Guys like Douglas Utu, who's almost a 5-star prospect that's coming on campus for the spring game. Imagine how good of a player he's going to be if Gunnar Gatula, who's only a 3-star, works out. So again, you want to watch him. A guy who I think has a really good ceiling. He has that positional flexibility, plays tackle, plays guard. And Nebraska is really trying to put a foothold in Nebraska with these linemen, but not only Nebraska, but out west. So yeah, that's my number 1 or number 2, excuse me.
Yeah, and to your point, offensive line been a big pain in the side of Nebraska fans for a while. However, a lot of people not paying enough attention or giving enough credit when talking about the offensive line last year, I believe, just because the offense was so bad that they didn't really see that the offensive line made a pretty good increase and pretty good jump in terms of year over year. And to your point, just expect nothing more or nothing less this coming season because Raiola's done a great job. Everybody thought Raiola was retained to get Dylan. And then when he didn't get Dylan, that whole thing came out and they're like, well, why do we keep all this other stuff? And then he goes and gets a pay increase. And it's obvious why. He's developing these guys that they are improving. And this is one of the better offensive lines even last year that we have seen in some time. So yeah, Gunnar, starting for Lincoln Southeast was one of the top 35 offensive tackles in the country, just a very, very large human being at that. So very, very excited about him. And I will slide over to one of those names I was mentioning that is one of the bigger names. But, just some of the things that the coaching staff has said about the wide receivers. But Jamal Banks is mine. Obvious reasons why Jamal Banks is very important to this team, right? We all know about the size, the physical attributes, the athleticism, his ability to go up and get 50-50 balls. Like he knows how to use his body. There's a difference between having physical attributes and knowing how to utilize those, right? Jamal Banks is very good at using the tools that were given to him. There's a couple of things, that you would like to see a little bit better, but he's a taller receiver. He's a little bit tall in terms of when he's at the line and when he's breaking into his routes. But those are things that can be developed. I think one of the biggest things was in hearing the staff talking about some of these guys, in the wide receiver core as a whole last week, about them being able to kind of beats press coverages and being able to win on some of these routes and being able to kind of, because they are playing against a very good defense in, Nebraska's defense. So being able to see what these guys are able to do, and a guy like Jamal Banks, especially against press coverage, he's going to be one of those guys that needs to get off press coverage, especially in the red zone, especially in goal line situations. If we do want to kind of throw a little post fade to the back of the end zone. So I want to see those little nuances of his game. I want to see if his route running has improved, if he's done a little bit better about, being able to, extend those routes off and be able to do choice routes. One of the things that he does well is he's able to maintain the sideline. He's able to not let somebody push him over to the sideline. But what about those routes to the in breaking parts of the field? Like, how is he able to break off the top of those routes? Is he able to create separation against some of these guys? How is he going to do it? Is he able to use it with his footwork? Is he using his hand? So there's a lot of nuances to the wide receiver position that I want to see Jamal Banks improve upon, because we know when it comes to just receiving, when it comes to catching, the dude doesn't drop the ball. He doesn't drop the ball. It reminds me a lot of DeAndre Hopkins and him and Isaiah Nair. I said this before. They remind me a lot of the 2017 Texans with Will Fuller and DeAndre Hopkins, outside of Will Fuller not having any hands, but just that speed and that possession receiver combo. So excited to see Jamal Banks' development, because that Wake Forest offense wasn't very good. There wasn't a lot of development there in terms of just, being able to develop as a wide receiver in that offense. And I think he has the potential to take a huge leap this year, but it's all going to start with seeing the work that he put in this spring. So,
yeah, I mean, we talk about some of the guys that are the most hyped up going into this game. Number one's Dylan Raiola. I think number two is Jamal Banks, obviously, with him doing what he did at Wake Forest. And I've said this time and time again at my channel. If Wake Forest had better quarterback play last year, he would already be in the NFL. He would be one of those guys you see drafted next week in the third, fourth round. So, yeah, Jamal Banks is a guy you can throw it up to, 50-50 ball. Not the fastest guy in the world, not the best route running in the world, but his hands are so sure. He uses his frame so well. Yeah, you feel really good about him, and it's time to prove it. It's time to prove that he's wide receiver one. And Matt Rule's also said he's a leader. He's a guy who showed up to Lincoln. He was already building connections with Dylan Raiola, building connections with the rest of the wide receivers. It's time to see that, time to see him as one of the bigger captains. I know Nebraska and Matt Rule don't really have formal captains, but one of the bigger leaders and guys that we can go back to this year.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's going to be key for the quarterbacks. That's another thing too, is like they are probably going to turn to him in this spring game as a sure-handed option when they need a guy to go to. Haven't had that in the past. We've used the tight ends before, but now we finally have a guy that can do that. Let's see how these quarterbacks utilize him too.
All right. Next. Yeah, let's get to my third player, and this is Kai Wallen on the defensive line. So with Gunnar Gatula, I said that I wanted to watch him because of the depth on that O-line. Now it's time to see about the depth on this D-line. And we're talking about Kai Wallen. People forget that he was one of the MVPs of the spring game last year, had 4 tackles, 2 TFLs, 1 sack, 1 fumble recovery. He was all over the field making plays left and right. A guy from JUCO, he committed last year. He still has 2-3 years left of eligibility. And again, the pass rush is looking very good for Nebraska. He just adds another element to that. And he's not a one-trick pony. He's really good in the run game as well. He's always moving his hands. He contains the run. He gets to the quarterback. Not a liability at all. And one of those guys who has a higher ceiling for Nebraska, even though he only has 2 years left. And again, it's just a testament to Terrence Knighton, the D-line coach, a guy who really did not have too much experience before we got to Nebraska, how he's developing these young guys, these guys who've been on campus for 1-2 years. It's all about depth in the O-line and the D-line. That's what you see in college football all the time. These positions get banged up like no other. You got to have, 2-3 guys on the bench that you feel comfortable putting in Big Ten play. And Kai Wallen hopefully is one of those guys you can rotate in and out, maybe for Cameron Lenhard, maybe for Princewell, Emmanuel. And you could put him in a pass rush situation to get to the quarterback, and you feel perfectly fine with that. So that's my third guy to watch out for. I'm also going to say James Williams, another JUCO guy. I want to watch out for him as well. Has got some hype in spring practice. Very similar player.
Yeah. Kai, 6'5", he has the physical traits to be a very, very good edge rusher. And like you said, it's just a matter of development, which we know the staff cares more about than anything. Sky's the limit for a player like him, 6'5", 250, and top 40 junior college prospect according to 24/7 Sports, 3-star recruit, and yeah, man, just he's one of those guys that has limited experience, but the upside is there. In American River 2022, 33 tackles, 5 sacks in 10 games. 5 sacks in 10 games. That's nothing. That's no small feat right there. 35 tackles, 14 TFLs, and 9.5 sacks in 2021 at Jesuit High School. So, yeah, a lot of upside potential there. And you got to love what we're seeing right now in terms of the edge being built up and some of the guys that we have. We have some serious dudes coming off of that edge, and the future looks extremely bright the longer we go on. So, I'm going to shift it over to the linebacker position, but also potentially, edge Stephon Thompson, right? And I'm a big Stephon Thompson fan. I have been since we got him from Syracuse. Again, he has that familiarity of the 3-3-5. When he was over at Syracuse, as we know, got the injury. But in, his freshman year was one of the first true freshmen to start for Syracuse in, I believe, 10 years, something along those lines. Set true freshman records, set all kinds of records in Syracuse. And, he got the ACL tear. And when he came back, believe it or not, I know a lot of people will point to the drop off in terms of production off of the ACL tear. But coming off of the ACL tear, he still had the second most tackles on the Syracuse team and was behind a guy who ultimately went to the NFL. And so with Stephon Thompson, everything's there. He's another year removed from the ACL injury. He has familiarity with Tony White. He knows the 3-3-5 inside and out. One of the things that we have been hearing from the coaching staffs is, in a couple of when they mention his name, talking about how he was behind in some aspects, behind in certain details of the winter mat drills, and a couple other times they had mentioned it. But when I hear that on the surface, what that points out to me is I think that they are just really kind of holding Stephon Thompson to a different standard. And I think that's part of what you're hearing. I think Tony White has a different standard for Stephon just because he's been a part of his system before. They've worked together before. He knows what he can get out of Stephon Thompson. He knows that the standard here is way different than it was at Syracuse. I love Stephon Thompson as a do-it-all type of guy. I also think he can move down and come off the edge. And I'm really, really excited to see the edge and linebacker rotation, especially with this defense now that we've got some of these pieces in place for sure.
Yeah, the linebacker room in general is a big question mark, and Stephon Thompson right up there. You mentioned it. The coaching staff said that he got to campus kind of out of shape, wasn't really doing the right things for that Nebraska culture. But again, he was one of the more productive players in the country, had 130 tackles in the 2 years he was healthy in 2021 and 2023 with Syracuse.
Yep.
And again, I mean, he's a guy that is a plug and play type of player that you felt very confident about landing, you can just put in as a starter on that Mike spot. And he's going to just command that the entire season. But again, Stephon Thompson, hopefully he can produce the level that we've seen before. And then you also want to watch out for some of those depth pieces in that linebacker room, because it's crucial for that 3-3-5 to have solid linebackers. And you lose, of course, Luke Reimer and Nick Henrich, 2 big gaps to fill. So hopefully Stephon Thompson can fill at least one of those.
Yep.
All right, let's take it to my 4th player. You mentioned Bly Hill, who Matt Rhule talked about being cornerback 2 as of right now. I'm going to go to the player who I actually think is going to be cornerback 2 when it's all said and done, when we're going into our first game versus UTEP. And this is Ethan Nation. In my opinion, the most athletically gifted corner we've seen in a long time wearing a Nebraska uniform. And Matt Rhule said something earlier in spring practice that really got me fired up. He said he never sits talented players on the bench. And that was a big testament to what happened last year with Ethan Nation. Nation barely played defense, but he's so athletically gifted, where Matt Rhule put him on special teams just to get the ball in his hands. So not only do you feel good about him being a plug-and-play type of guy in the secondary, but you feel good about him potentially returning kicks, returning punts. So that's definitely something to watch out for in the spring game. Is he back there to return a punt? Is he back there to return a kick? See what he can do with the ball in his hands. But really, I also want to see his technique in man coverage. He's ideally a boundary corner. You have him man-to-man to one of the better Big Ten players you're going up against at that wideout spot. Can he have good technique in a press coverage? Is he better in zone? Is he better in man? Because we don't really have any answers in a Nebraska uniform. We only have to look at his high school film. So a lot of question marks around Ethan Nation, but I'm going to tell you this. If his talent is any indictment of how good he's going to be in Nebraska uniform, he's going to be one of those players that we talk about as a potential top 3, top 2 round draft pick guy, an all Big Ten type of caliber player. So feel really good about Ethan Nation. Again, there is a question mark by his name. How good can he truly be? Is he going to take those growing pains? A lot of times, the second year in a cornerback's career is really tough. Tommy Hill, for example. Tommy Hill was a stud as a true freshman at Arizona State in the secondary, went over to Nebraska and struggled mightily. So much that we had to move him to wide out, then moved him back to corner. So does he go through that slump in the second year? We'll have to see that. But Ethan Nation, man, I'm pumped up about him. But we really need some young guys to step up in that cornerback room because there's a lot of question marks there. Besides him, Tommy Hill and Bly Hill, you have almost nobody with Malcolm Hartzog moving over to secondary. You have a couple true freshmen. You have a couple of guys who are going into their second year, like Jeremiah Charles, who I consider to be project players. So you kind of need Ethan Nation to be that depth piece that you feel good about cornerback 3 or even cornerback 2 and hope that he stays healthy as well.
For sure. And Ethan Nation's one of those guys that Matt Rule loves, dual sport athlete. The guy's just the athletic profile is out of this world. And I've said this time and time again, and you've heard it, Matt Rule always prefers athleticism. He prefers athletic lineages to develop skill sets because he says there's a ceiling on athleticism, which there is, but there's not a ceiling on development. So he fits right into the mold of what Matt Rule wants. And like you said, those project players like Jeremiah Charles and stuff like that, those are the guys that they can really hammer on the technique and then bring these guys along, with those guys. And these guys can kind of lead them in terms of technique and stuff like that, because, a very raw player like a Jeremiah Charles is going to need a guy like, somebody who like an Ethan Nation, who is very similar in experience, but also just a little bit ahead of the game in terms of football. And so let's bring it over to mine, Emmett Johnson. The reason I got Emmett Johnson on here, and I know Emmett Johnson had a bit of a breakout last year, but coming into last season when I did the running back preview, I was a huge fan of Emmett Johnson because I don't know if a lot of people realize this or not, but Emmett Johnson was actually splitting reps with the first team last spring and was one of those guys that they were very high on coming into the season. And so it was no surprise when he came in and stepped into the role. It seemed to be a surprise to a lot. But I think Emmett Johnson, a lot of people are excited about Dante Dowdle and stuff like that. I think Emmett Johnson has the potential to be just as good, if not better, as Dante Dowdle. The way Emmett Johnson runs the ball, his vision, he's one of those guys who can do everything, but he can do it efficiently, right? Like whenever Nebraska's offense was not moving the ball at all last year, Emmett Johnson was still averaging about 4 yards per carry in those games, And so it's one of those things where it's like the passing game wasn't even there, So all these teams had to do was really stack the box and prep up for the run game. And Emmett Johnson was still able to find creases, find holes. And another thing that he did was he protected the ball pretty well. You would see Emmett Johnson when he was running into the end zone with nobody around him, he'd still put two hands, he'd still put both arms on the ball to protect you. Just as kind of like one of those things. It's like, this has been such a hassle of ours, but he's carrying that rock, with 3 points of contact at all time. And just the way he runs the ball, he runs it with, he hits the hole with velocity, he hits it with aggression, but he has very good vision too. And he has very good feel for, I guess he has a very good feel for what he needs to do situationally. Football instinct. There we go. I should say football instinct for him is one of the things that I think stands out to me the most. And it's one of those things that won't jump off to you. You're never going to see it. But if you watch him carry the ball, if you watch the film and you watch the way he sees the field, you can start to see some of that instinctual stuff that kind of separates him from these other guys, where he may not be necessarily crazy advanced skill set wise over a guy like Dowdle. Dowdle might be more talented in terms of that, but if one guy's got football instinct that the other guy doesn't, then that's going to give him a leg up. And right now, to me, Emmett Johnson is my favorite running back in this room. I'm not saying Dowdle can't be that, but I think right now, Emmett Johnson to me is my favorite, and I'm curious to see just kind of in all the ways they utilize him and how they kind of have that running back rotation going. And also, what does Dowdle look like, versus Emmett Johnson? We don't know whether we're going to get a running back by committee, which we probably are going to get a rotation of sorts. Everybody wants that bell cow back, but if that's not the case, we got a good stable of running backs to have, and I think Emmett Johnson's going to be the front of that pack.
Yeah, talking about Dante Dowdle, I think a lot of people thought that he was going to be the unanimous running back one going into this year, but I've been preaching this on my channel. Emmett Johnson's your guy. No doubt about it. The way that Matt Rule talks about him, the way that EJ Barthel talks about him, every single day he's making plays in practice, scrimmages. There was a Nebraska legend, Amon Green, at the scrimmage the other day, and he said that Emmett Johnson was one of the better players he's seen in a Nebraska uniform in a long time. Again, Dante Dowdle has a very high ceiling, but I think we're underestimating the ceiling that Emmett Johnson has. He's a late bloomer type of player. A lot of these guys who are playing for Nebraska, when they were in high school, they played in varsity freshman, sophomore year. Emmett Johnson didn't really break on the scene until his senior year of high school. He didn't have any stars. He didn't really have any offers, and then he won the Player of the Year in Minnesota. He had, again, let me remind you and all the viewers of his stats. 2,500 yards in the senior year of high school, 41 touchdowns. In his entire career, he had over 500 carries. He's familiar with being a bell cow running back. He can take that heavy workload. He's an all-purpose back. You feel good about him in the passing game, blocking for your quarterback. So I love Emmett Johnson. I sing his praises all the time. And Dante Dowdle, very good player. I believe he has a high ceiling as well. But it's really production versus guys who haven't produced. Emmett Johnson had over 400 yards last year for Nebraska. Dante Dowdle last year for Oregon really played in one game, and the other games he did play in were in garbage time where the game was already won for Oregon. So Emmett Johnson has experience in this Matt Rule offense. And again, if you want you want to predict who this running back one is, just go to what Matt Rule's saying. And yeah, I think Emmett Johnson's the guy, and I really want him to have a big day. So we don't have to hear the storyline all offseason. Like, I feel good about him.
Yeah, and it's kind of unfortunate that the way Oregon handled Dowdle and burned his red shirt, but yeah, like you said, it's not that we're necessarily saying one is that much better than the other, but having those two to complement each other, man, that's going to be a good problem to have.
All right, let's go to my fifth and final prospect, and everybody's talking about Dylan Raiola, and rightly so. I'm going to go to another name in that quarterback room, true freshman Daniel Kaelin. So I've watched Daniel Kaelin a lot throughout high school. Of course, I'm an Omaha guy. I go to a lot of high school games around the metro. And I also did a film reaction for Daniel Kaelin. And again, right off the bat, when you're watching him on film, you see the intangibles. You see how great his arm is, the fact that he can throw the ball 50, 60 yards, that he has good pocket presence, that he's really accurate. And people forget that he was an Elite 11, one of those guys who were in Elite 11, one of the better quarterbacks in the country. But with that being said, I still felt like he's a very raw prospect. What I saw in film was that he wasn't great in progressions. Really, his footwork needed to be worked on. And a lot of times, this pocket presence, he doesn't have that natural ability like Dylan Raiola does. So I really want to see that in particular in the spring game. And I think a lot of times, Matt Rule was hyping him up all the time. You say, oh, yep, Dylan and Daniel Kaelin are doing a good job in practice. But we don't really know that because he's not going to go up there and hype Raiola up and not Daniel Kaelin. So again, there's a lot of question marks on how he really is playing. I know that they posted a highlight on the Nebraska Twitter, maybe once or twice, of him throwing an interception. So again, I perceived him as a really raw prospect who has a high ceiling, but you're not really going to see him play within the first 2 years. I want to be proved wrong here. I want to have him go out there, ball out, maybe even give Raiola a run for his money. But yeah, you want to see those traits, those progressions, the footwork, the pocket presence, stuff that I thought he kind of struggled with at Bellevue West. And it also should be mentioned that when he was with the Thunderbirds, it was a very quick offense where he was going to one read, check down, check down, check down, screen pass, slant over the middle, out route, right? That was the entirety of Bellevue West offense over the last, 4 or 5 years, even when Kaelin wasn't there. So how does he progress to more of a Big Ten offense where, of course, it's going to be more complex and you're going up against more skilled players on defense? That's always the number one thing when it comes to quarterbacks. It's not really learning the playbook. It's getting up to the speed of the game to the Big Ten level, because it's a huge jump up from, again, playing Class A high school football in Nebraska to playing Big Ten teams. Yeah, that's completely different. So again, I want Daniel Kaelin the ball out, man. Again, he was a guy who was loyal to Nebraska. He could have went somewhere else when Dylan Raiola committed. Okay, let's put it frankly, he was backstabbed. He was basically ensured that he was the guy. Last second, they say, nope, we're going after Raiola again. And he stood his ground. He was loyal. That's what being a Nebraska player is all about. So, yeah, I want to see him go out there, give Raiola a run for his money. Obviously, Raiola is going to be the better player. Raiola is going to start in the fall. No debate that. But, man, Daniel Kalen, want to see some of those traits from him. And hopefully he's one of those guys who maybe when Dylan Raiola is gone, maybe when he goes to the NFL, you feel really good about plugging in Kalen as being another guy, maybe like a Mac Jones type of player where Alabama for the longest time, they had Tua Tagovailoa. Tua goes over the NFL, then Mac goes in there for 1 year, balls out, goes to the NFL. That's a situation where I want to see here, where you have Raiola for 3 years, goes to the NFL. You plug in Kalen 1 year, he is off to the NFL. So that's what I want to see there from Daniel.
Yep. And I could spend a little bit more time here on Kalen because, a lot of people are interested in this subject, but to your point, right? Like, and I'll start by this. To your point about what happened during the recruiting process. Yes. I mean, Daniel Kalen is a unicorn in today's college football landscape with how he handled that. As soon as, the quarterback spot in the recruiting class opened, when Raiola committed to Georgia, Kalen was at Missouri. He committed, immediately flipped over to Nebraska, right? In that he gained a lot of the fan base. And then insert Raiola coming back. A lot of people thought it was a done deal. Kalen was going to leave, decides to, stay true to himself, go where he wants to go, and fight for the starting role. And I think in a way, it's caused this weird, I guess, polar opposite of storylines here, where it's like you have Dylan Raiola, who's the true freshman, 5-star, and everybody's like, well, can we really start a 5-star true freshman? But then at the same time, those same people are like, why is everybody sleeping on Kalen? Well, let's not get it twisted here. Kalen is also, in the same recruiting class and is a 4-star versus a 5-star for a reason. And that's not anything to do with that. He's not a good player. He's still a 4-star. He's still elite 11 QB. But it just means that, to your point, he has some of those things that still need refined. The offense was a little bit more simplistic. He's not as good at reading shell coverage. He's not as good at identifying different coverages and things like that. And those are certain things that'll show up on his film. And I do think that part of what they are trying to do is really just show us the battle between those two. They're really trying to show us some highlights of Kalen, put some bad about Raiola, things like that. And I think they're just being transparent with what's actually going on. But at the end of the day, when football comes to football, Raiola is better at football right now. And that's just the best way to put it. He is the more complete quarterback. He has a bigger arm. He has a wider variety of arm slots and ways he can throw the ball. He's very good in a lot of different situational aspects. I mean, when pressure's on his face, you'll see on Raiola's film where he has a guy literally taking him down by his legs, and he's still throwing it 55 yards on target, down the field. And I don't think Kalen just quite has that ability to do those things. And that upside and those already developed skill sets that Raiola has is going to be the difference. But like you said, I would not be surprised in the slightest way to see that this legitimately came down to the wire between these two, because I do think they're very close in terms of skill set. I just think Raiola has the edge, and I do hope he sticks around long enough so it can be something like that where, once Raiola's gone, he steps in there and we get to, he gets to see a payoff for him sticking around as opposed to him ultimately transferring anyways, which is what I don't think any of us want to see. So, and then, Heinrich Haarberg, of course. I won't leave him out of this before people comment. Heinrich Haarberg, we love Heinrich Haarberg. Okay. I get it. We love Heinrich Haarberg, but he's a football player. Heinrich Haarberg is a football player who has played quarterback, essentially. He's not a quarterback. And he's just what a football player can do, and a guy who's an athlete, they can be good at a bunch of different things. And if you put a very athletic guy with a high football IQ and a attitude that he just wants to win, he can probably be okay as a quarterback. He's just not going to beat out these guys who were just built to be quarterbacks. So for the Haarberg crew there, what were we going to say?
And one thing I want to mention is that we just talked about Daniel Kalen, struggling to read defenses in Class A high school football. Imagine how hard that's going to be for Harburg to get to that level. I mean, he's going to his 4th year and he still hasn't got to that level that we want him to be. So, we like Harburg. Again, he's a football player, like you said, a guy who gives it all his all for the state, for the team. But yeah, he's not a Big Ten quarterback. He's not a starting caliber quarterback. He's not even a guy you feel comfortable being that backup. But hopefully he can be. Hopefully he can be a guy who's more of a game manager this year.
Yeah, with him, it's mechanics. Mechanically, he's not there yet. And at this point, if you're still working on mechanics at this point in his career,
Yeah.
he's not ready. And Raul, I mean, Rule likes guys who he can develop. He likes multi-year guys. So of course he's going to prefer, the Raiolas and the Kalins over the Harburgs because you develop him and he's out. So all right, sliding over, and I had to throw an offensive lineman in here for good measure, Justin Evans Jenkins. And aside from having the same first name as me, me and Justin he's one of those guys that was kind of a statistical outlier when it comes to certain blocking numbers. His PFF blocking grade was 81.6, which is insanely high. However, run block grade leaves a lot to be desired, 58.8, which is fairly low. However, Justin Evans Jenkins being as young as he is, and the development we've already seen of these offensive line, I think his upside is tremendous because I am a huge, huge fan of offensive and defensive linemen, but especially offensive linemen who have wrestled before. And those guys are guys who know how to use their strength. They know how to use leverage. They know how to attack leverage. They know how to stay balanced. They have so many tricks up their sleeve that they can utilize in their skill set that can help them. You look at Nash Hutmacher again, like this coming season, he's going to be in the best shape of his life because of that wrestling season. Wrestling's the hardest sport there is in terms of training for. And he's going to be in the best shape of his life. And Justin Evans Jenkins he's out of New Jersey. New Jersey is a very physical brand of football that they play over there. And that's another thing. So you got a guy with a wrestling background paired with a place that is physical. And not only that, it was state champion in 2021 in New Jersey. So the guy's potential is through the roof. And he's one of those guys. He played offensive and defensive lineman, so he understands what the defensive line is going to bring. He just has a full grasp of the game and how to utilize his body. I think this is just the perfect base to build an offensive lineman from. You have a big, he's 6'1". He's not the tallest guy in the world, but he's a big guy overall, and just a guy who knows how to use his body, knows how to use his leverage, and is just scratching the surface on what he can be as a football player, So really excited to see how they can develop him and his run blocking, especially. But I think that as the offense kind of balances out and gets a little better, and the line as in its entirety gets a little better, because at some points during that, the line was pretty messed up overall when he was in the games. It's one of those things I just think that he is going to potentially be one of these guys that's going to really surprise us this coming season on this offensive line if he can work his way, into a strong part of the rotation. It's going to have to be more balanced, but really want to see what he can do against this, strong defensive line in the spring game for sure. That'll be our first little test on his development this season.
Yeah, one final thing about Justin Evans Jenkins that I love and that Matt Rule loves is that positional flexibility on the offensive line. The ability to be a guard and go in there and play center on the two deep, or the ability to be a swing tackle on the bench that you can feel comfortable putting in him at OT or a guard. And not necessarily Justin Evans Jenkins, he doesn't play tackle, but a player like that on the bench. You feel comfortable with that positional flexibility. That's something that Matt Rule loves, something that I love. And yeah, I project him to be a starter on this offensive line this year with the way Micah Mazuka has struggled in spring practice.
Yeah.
But he's also going to be that two deep center. He has experience there. So if Ben Scott ever gets banged up. But yeah, it's that positional flexibility that we see throughout this offensive line. Turner Corcoran's a guy who has that positional flexibility. Teddy Prohaska's a guy who has that positional flexibility. A lot of these younger tackles like Grant Bricks, I think could be really good at guard. He's currently playing tackle, right? Has that positional flexibility. Expect Nebraska to really try to get guys who can play multiple positions on the O-line going forward. And Justin Evans Jenkins, really good potential. Like you said, played in New Jersey, actually played better on the D line throughout his high school career. He was all state on the defensive line, but again, really high potential. And a guy, whenever you're playing Big Ten O line in your second year of college, you did something right. And at the high level that he did, yeah, he's going to be a guy to watch out for the next couple of years for Nebraska.
Yeah, it has the potential to be. Yeah, I don't know if you remember Kenyon Green out of Texas A&M, but it very much, Kenyon Green could play anywhere on that offensive line, and ended up going in the first round because of it. Not a very good NFL career so far, but Justin Evans Jenkins can be one of those guys, and that's how much value those guys got. Kenyon Green was drafted mainly because of his versatility in the offensive line, and so there's a lot of value to be had in a guy who can move around even on just the offensive line. So. But anything else before any honorable mentions or anything else you want to touch on before we conclude this first part of our spring preview?
Yeah, one quick honorable mention here, not necessarily a depth piece, but I really want to see what Thomas Fidone has. Again, he's a guy who's been a little bit of a woulda, coulda, shoulda throughout his career. Obviously, got injured, not his fault. Last year had a pretty solid outing, especially when Harburg was at quarterback. But really want him to take that step that we know he can. He has such a high potential, and I want him to see him, take over the game in the spring game. And one last thing, as a tight end, you need to be a safety valve for a young quarterback. That's so important that if Raiola's struggling or he's rolling out to the right, left-hand side, you could just dump it off over to Thomas Fidone. He's got to build that connection. So that's one really quick honorable mention that I want to watch play. But yeah.
Yep. Exciting stuff, man. I'm really, really ready for this to finally get here so we can actually talk about the play and not what we hope from the play. But yeah, so that'll do it for our first part here in our spring preview. Wilson, thank you for coming on and doing this one. And then we are going to send you over to his channel on a Wednesday for the part 2 of this series. Okay, so make sure that you leave here and then you go over to his channel, subscribe, and hit the bell notifications. That way, when it goes on his channel, you can watch part 2 of this. We'll be going over our spring storylines. So, Wilson, thank you for joining me, man. And anything you want to say to the people or plug anything else before we conclude here?
No, nothing really to say, but Justin, he does a great job on this channel. Got a lot of stuff planned throughout the off season, so again, make sure to subscribe to him as well because that was a great time.
Appreciate it, man. And links to his stuff will be in the description. So I will see y'all in part 2 over on his channel. So peace.